August 21, 1942. Alligator Creek, Guadalcanal. The moon hung low over the palms, its pale light skimming across the dark water of the Lunga as the jungle pressed in on every side. Humidity clung to the air like a second skin. Crickets pulsed in rhythmic waves. And somewhere in the darkness, just beyond the riverbank, you could hear them breathing. United States Marines. Foxholes carved into the damp earth. Rifles cradled tight. Helmets tipped forward. The smell of wet canvas, sweat, and gun oil hung over the 1st Marine Division like a haze. Just past midnight, Private First Class Daniel "Red" Harrigan shifted his weight, feeling the mud suck against his boots as he listened to the jungle. The men around him sat still, so still that the only movement came from the steam rising off their uniforms. They knew something was coming. They felt it before they heard it, an instinct born from weeks of fighting on this island the Japanese had called unassailable. Then, a distant whistle. Not a bird. Not the wind. A signal. Moments later, shapes emerged from the tree line. Shadows. Dozens. Then hundreds. Imperial Japanese Army infantry, soldiers of the elite Ichiki detachment, moving in tight ranks with bayonets fixed, teeth clenched, eyes sharp with a mix of fever and conviction. Captain Charles Brush raised his hand. Hold. The line tensed. The Japanese charged. A roar ripped across the riverbank as machine guns opened fire. The Marines' M1917S and Browning .30 calories spat long arcs of tracer fire that tore across the clearing, illuminating the chaos as silhouettes collapsed into the reeds. The river burst with splashes, some from bullets, others from bodies. Red Harrigan braced his bar against his shoulder. The weapon kicked like a mule, but he held the line, firing burst after burst into the tide of soldiers screaming, "Tenno Hika Banzai." The night exploded into muzzle flashes and flying soil as Marines dug into the earth, firing through the underbrush, through the smoke, through the noise. The Japanese kept coming. Even wounded, even burning, even crawling, their momentum never broke. They surged forward in desperate waves, trying to shatter the Marine line with shock, steel, and sheer will. But by dawn, silence. Bodies littered the banks. Smoke rose from the jungle floor like fog. And for the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers, survivors hiding in the mangroves, wrote in their diaries of an enemy who did not crack, did not falter, and did not run. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, one of the few survivors of the Ichiki detachment, later described what he saw in his notebook, later recovered by American intelligence. The Marines fight with a stubbornness I have never witnessed. They shoot accurately even under darkness. They do not fear night attacks. They do not break. Their fire discipline is terrifying. This is not the enemy our instructors described. As the sun climbed over the palm tops, General Alexander Vandegrift walked the riverbank with his officers, surveying the damage. The Marines had held, barely, but they had done so against one of the most aggressive night assaults the Imperial Japanese Army had ever launched. And the Japanese, for the first time, began reassessing the enemy they believed would collapse quickly under pressure. But the truth was simple. Guadalcanal had changed everything. Here, for the first time, Japanese soldiers witnessed the raw endurance, discipline, and ferocity of United States Marines, qualities forged not from ancient warrior tradition, but from relentless training, cohesive unit culture, and a doctrine built entirely around assault, defense, and survival. Yet Guadalcanal was only the beginning. As the Marines secured perimeter lines and pushed deeper into the island, the Japanese High Command began compiling intelligence reports, combing through captured journals and interrogation transcripts to understand this new adversary. They noted how Marines moved through jungle terrain with coordinated squad-level tactics, unlike the linear formations typical of many Allied armies. They recorded how Marine riflemen were trained to fire under stress, maintain spacing, and operate semi-independently. They observed how Marine engineering crews fortified positions overnight with barbed wire, trenches, and interlocking fields of fire. One report from the Japanese 17th Army Intelligence Section wrote, "Marines possess an unusual ability to recover from exhaustion. Their units fight even when cut off. Their officers lead from the front and their NCOs control their units with remarkable precision. They are an enemy that must be destroyed entirely to be defeated." By late 1942, As the battle for Henderson Field raged, this respect hardened into something deeper and more unsettling, a realization that the Americans were not fighting as the Japanese had been promised. They were not soft, poorly trained conscripts. They were not dependent on constant resupply. They were not unwilling to suffer casualties. They were something else. And as the Marines pushed toward the Matanuca River, clearing bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers, Japanese commanders observed another factor that would define the entire Pacific campaign: Marine combined arms coordination. Even with limited resources, poorly defended coastlines, and improvised airfields, the Marines fused infantry, naval fire support, aviation, and engineering into a seamless combat machine. Japanese patrols noted how dive bombers struck with uncanny accuracy, how artillery crews locked onto targets with breathtaking speed, and how infantrymen communicated with hand signals and whistles to shift assault formations under fire. At night, when the Japanese assumed they would dominate, the Marines proved even more dangerous. Night fighting squads developed ambush lines, tripwire alarms, and overlapping sectors of observation. Marines learned to track sound in the jungle, firing short, controlled bursts that cut through night raids with chilling precision. The Japanese had expected fear. Instead, they found experience. They found adaptation. They found an enemy who learned quickly and killed efficiently. In the months that followed, as disease, starvation, and attrition decimated Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, something emerged in their diaries and letters again and again. The Marines do not fear death. Of course, historians know this was not true in a literal sense. Marines felt fear, every man on that island felt it. But what the Japanese perceived was a cultural difference: the Marine Corps' institutional emphasis on aggression, cohesion, and relentless offensive spirit, contrasted with the Japanese doctrine of shock tactics and death before surrender. To Japanese officers trained to break the enemy's will through sudden violence, the Marine response was baffling and terrifying. Lieutenant Tanaka wrote again before his evacuation attempt. "They fight like warriors, but they use machines like devils. Their artillery is unending. Their aircraft arrive even in storms. Their discipline never falters." But the Japanese high command still believed Guadalcanal was an anomaly, an unexpected setback, not a pattern. They had not yet seen Tarawa. They had not yet seen Saipan. They had not yet seen Iwo Jima. They had not yet seen what happened when the Marine Corps landed with overwhelming firepower, perfected amphibious assault tactics, and fought across fortified islands defended to the last man. Guadalcanal was only the introduction. The real lesson, the reason Japanese soldiers later admitted they feared Marines above all Allied troops, was still taking shape in the crucible of the Pacific. And it would be forged in blood, steel, and volcanic ash. November 20, 1943. Bidio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Dawn broke like fire over the lagoon, casting a blood-red shimmer across the water as if foreshadowing the slaughter to come. The tide was wrong, every Marine on the Higgins boats could feel it. The coral heads lurked just beneath the surface like jagged teeth. The distant rumble of naval guns still vibrated in their chests, but the smoke was already thinning, revealing the outlines of pillboxes that had survived the bombardment. On the deck of his landing craft, Corporal James "Mac" McAllister checked his M1 Garand again, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline pounding through him like a second heartbeat. The boat reeked of diesel, salt, vomit, and hopeless prayer. Ahead lay Bidio, an island less than 3 miles long and barely 800 yards across. Flat. Featureless. A speck of land surrounded by reefs and sea foam, but fortified like a steel citadel. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had boasted, "1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years." Mac wasn't a million. He was one Marine among thousands. The ramp dropped. And the Pacific erupted. Japanese machine guns screamed from the seawall, raking the lagoon with streams of rising water and vaporized coral. Mortar rounds burst overhead, showering the Marines with fragments. Men dropped instantly, cut down before they even took a step. The air thickened with smoke, screams, the smell of burning cordite. Some boats grounded on the reef, forcing men overboard. Waist deep. Chest deep. Some vanished entirely into holes carved by incoming fire. Mac plunged into the water, gripping his rifle high as he fought the current. Around him, Marines struggled toward the beach, some wounded, some already lifeless, drifting backward with the tide. Every foot forward cost a breath. Every breath felt stolen. Japanese gunners fired with ferocious precision from reinforced bunkers of coconut logs and steel, fortresses designed to survive anything short of direct naval hits. And many had survived. For Japanese defenders, this was the moment they had prepared for, the decisive annihilation of a Marine landing. Captain Takeo Sugai watched the unfolding carnage from his observation post and recorded later. The Marines came even when the sea consumed them. They advanced even when our bullets tore them apart. Their courage was madness. No soldier could continue under such fire, but the Marines did. By the time Corporal Mack crawled onto the sand, his uniform shredded, his weapon barely functioning, the beach was a hellscape, bodies scattered among burning Amtraks, sand turned black with soot and blood. And yet, the line advanced. Fire teams maneuvered around ruined landing craft. Engineers pulled satchel charges from waterproof bags. Snipers scanned the upper bunkers. Squad leaders shouted above the chaos, ordering men to push forward, push closer, get right against the seawall where the machine guns couldn't depress far enough to hit. Get in tight. Move. Move. The Marines did what Marines always do, closed the distance, reorganized under fire, and struck back with cold efficiency. Bang. A flamethrower erupted, spewing a jet of fire that curled into a bunker's firing slit. Japanese soldiers screamed as flames rolled through the interior. Grenades followed, thousands of them, thrown into every hole, tunnel, and breach. The air filled with concussive blasts as Marines cleared bunker after bunker at knife fight range. At 11 a.m., the tide of battle began to turn. Slowly. Painfully. A few yards at a time. From his underground command center, Admiral Shibasaki realized something was wrong. His engineers and intelligence officers had told him no force could survive crossing Tarawa's lagoon under direct fire. They believed Marines would break, scatter, drown. But instead, Japanese spotters reported something else, something that unnerved even the most hardened officers. The Marines kept coming. Even when logic said they should be dead. Some came crawling, dragging wounded with them. Some came sprinting from shell crater to shell crater. Some came burning, shot, limping, but advancing nonetheless. A Japanese sergeant, wounded and delirious, reportedly muttered. They walk through bullets. They should fall, but they do not fall. This was the moment when Japanese perceptions of the Marine Corps shifted from respect to near mythology. Their earlier encounters on Guadalcanal could be explained by jungle tactics, ambushes, and starvation. But Tarawa? Tarawa was pure steel against steel. By nightfall, Marines had carved a foothold across the island's southern edge. But the cost was staggering. Hundreds lay dead on the tide line, young men whose names would soon be etched into memorials across the United States. Across the battlefield, Japanese soldiers prepared for counterattacks. They launched banzai charges through the darkness, shadows sprinting across the sand, bayonets glinting. But this wasn't jungle. It wasn't night fighting on Guadalcanal's winding riverbanks. This was open terrain. And the Marines were ready. Flare guns lit the sky with eerie brightness. Machine guns set up interlocking arcs. Rifles cracked in disciplined, measured volleys. The charges broke, shattered against organized Marine firepower. By dawn of the second day, American armor rolled across the beach. LVTs churned through debris. Engineers blew open more bunkers. Rifle companies advanced methodically, one intersection at a time. Japanese diaries recovered afterward captured their shock at Marine tactics. They coordinate guns, tanks, and flamethrowers with frightening speed. Their wounded are removed instantly, this strengthens their fighting spirit. Every Marine fights like a veteran. Even new soldiers fight to the death. By the third day, Tarawa was a graveyard. Only scattered Japanese holdouts remained, many choosing suicide over surrender. Out of nearly 4,800 Japanese troops on Bidio, only 17 survived. And those survivors, wounded, ashamed, and burned by flamethrower scars, told intelligence officers after the war. We feared the Marines. We feared no other enemy like them. They feared the relentless advance. They feared the coordination. They feared the refusal to break. They feared the knowledge that Marines would cross any distance, under any fire, to close with and destroy them. Most of all, they feared what Tarawa proved. The Americans were just getting started. Saipan was next. Then Peleliu. Then the volcanic fortress that would define the very essence of the Marine Corps. Iwo Jima. June 15, 1944. Off the coast of Saipan, northern Marianas. Before sunrise, the sea was already boiling with engines. Hundreds of landing craft formed gray silhouettes against the horizon, rolling up and down on swells that shimmered with streaks of phosphorescence. The roar of naval guns echoed over the water, deep, rhythmic thunder that shook the bones and rattled loose gear strapped to flak vests. In the pre-dawn gloom, Sergeant William Hawkins knelt in his Higgins boat, fingers curled around the edge of the ramp. He could see flashes onshore as Japanese coastal batteries began firing blind, their shells whistling overhead and crashing down into the surf. The explosion sent sheets of seawater arching into the sky. Marines ducked instinctively, some praying, some muttering curses, all waiting for the moment the ramp would drop. The briefing was simple: secure the beachhead, then push inland as fast as possible. But Hawk knew better. Saipan wasn't just another island. It was a fortress, layered fields of fire, inland ridges, spiderweb tunnels, and machine gun nests carved into coral. Japanese intelligence believed the Marines could never cross the beaches without being annihilated. The boat lurched violently as a shell splashed beside them, showering the Marines with brine and shrapnel. A man screamed. Another collapsed. Hawk grabbed the fallen Marine under the shoulders and dragged him behind the engine block as corpsmen moved in. "Stay with me, kid. Stay with me." But the Marine was already gone. The coxswain shouted over the roar, 30 seconds. Here it came. The smell of diesel thickened. The surf grew louder. The ramp slammed open. And the world turned white. Machine gun fire ripped across the water, chewing through men as they splashed into the surf. Artillery thundered overhead. The first wave staggered onto the sand, firing from the hip, diving behind dunes, clawing forward through explosions. Smoke billowed from burning Amtraks. Shattered Japanese bunkers smoldered near the waterline. Hawk sprinted across the beach, heart pounding like a drum in his throat. A mortar landed behind him, tossing him forward. Sand filled his mouth. He spat, rolled, fired at the nearest pillbox where tracers streaked out in flat arcs. "Kim! Lay down smoke." Private John Kim yanked a smoke grenade from his webbing, pulled the pin, and lobbed it into the open. A cloud of billowing white haze spread, giving Hawk's squad a moment to rush the bunker. "Stack up. Go." Flamethrower operator Private Torres moved to the front, fuel tank clanking. He squeezed the trigger, and a stream of fire roared into the firing slit, filling the bunker with swirling orange death. The screams inside lasted only seconds. The squad pushed deeper inland. Behind them, waves of Marines surged forward. Engineers blasted paths through minefields. Machine gun teams dropped into firing positions. Corpsmen dragged wounded men behind makeshift cover, ignoring their own fear, their own survival. By the end of the first day, Marines had carved out a foothold nearly a mile deep. But the Japanese weren't retreating. They were repositioning. In a cave overlooking the beach, Lieutenant Colonel Hachiro Kahara watched the Americans advance. He'd fought Chinese warlords, Siberian partisans, and had trained hundreds of cadets for the Imperial Army. But never had he seen infantry move like this. He wrote in his field diary, "These Marines close the distance too quickly. Their fire coordination is uncanny. Their courage defies logic. They move as if each man is guided by one mind." This was the same assessment that echoed across Japanese units from Guadalcanal to Tarawa. But Saipan added something new, and far more frightening: marine logistics. The Japanese were stunned by the speed at which the Americans poured guns, ammunition, tanks, medics, engineers, and radio teams onto the beach. The shoreline transformed into a functioning base within hours. Supplies flowed like a river. Artillery was zeroing in by mid-afternoon. Tanks rolled off landing craft by dusk. The Marines weren't just warriors. They were the spear point of an entire industrial giant. ##### Nightfall, the first Japanese counterattack. As darkness consumed the island, a wind kicked up across the cane fields. The rustle of leaves became a whispering warning. Hawk crouched behind a shattered Japanese field gun, listening. A distant chant rose from the ridge. Then hundreds of voices. then thousands. Tenno Hika Banzai. The ground shook as the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War thundered down the slopes. Japanese soldiers, infantry, engineers, medical staff, even wounded men, surged forward in a massed human wave, bayonets flashing under the moonlight. Hawk's machine gunner, Corporal Duke Harlan, opened fire. The M1919 rattled violently, spewing tracer fire into the oncoming tsunami. The first ranks collapsed, but more surged over them. Officers swung katanas. Some men carried only sticks, rocks, or empty rifles. But then, flare guns lit the sky, bathing the fields in harsh white light. Marine lines braced. Riflemen fired volleys. Artillery from the beach hammered the ridge. Tank shells whistled overhead. For an hour the earth shook with violence. By dawn, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. A survivor from the Imperial 136th Infantry Regiment later told interrogators, "We believed their line would break. No soldier could stand against such a charge. But the Marines did not waver. They killed us with machine-like precision. They did not fear death." #The civilian tragedy. Saipan also revealed another dimension of the conflict, the indoctrination of Japanese civilians. Marine units heard crying near the cliffs. Whole families, believing American propaganda to be monsters, hurled themselves over the edge. Marines, tough, battle-hardened men, begged, pleaded, even risked their lives trying to pull civilians back from suicide. But many jumped anyway. Japanese officers documented this, too. It shattered them. The propaganda they'd fed their own people now returned as a horrifying truth. And seeing Marines desperately trying to save civilians, at the cost of their own lives, left an unexpected mark on surviving Japanese officers. It contradicted everything they had been taught about American barbarians. It forced them to reassess the Marines not only as warriors, but as human beings. #Japan's high command panics. When Saipan fell, Japanese leadership realized something catastrophic. Marines were now within bomber range of Tokyo. The defeat shook the empire to its core. The Japanese prime minister resigned. Officers who fought on Saipan told their generals, "The Marines will destroy us. We cannot stop them island to island." But the next island would test both sides to the limit. A place of volcanic ash, sulfur fumes, perfect Japanese fortifications, and the most disciplined defensive commander Japan ever produced. General Tadamaki Kuribayashi. He had studied the Marines for years. He respected them more than any other enemy. And he intended to show Japan exactly how Marines fought, and how Japan must prepare to die against them. And the Marines would discover an enemy unlike any they ever faced. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. The sea was a sheet of steel under the morning sun, calm in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. Ahead, the island rose like a wound in the ocean. Black sand. Jagged ridges. Columns of volcanic steam drifting from cracks in the earth. And looming at the southern tip, like a crouched beast waiting to strike. Mount Suribachi. In the troop compartment of his Amtrak, Sergeant Dominic "Dom" Rinaldi tugged at his straps, feeling the vehicle rumble beneath him as it churned toward the beach. He'd been in battles before, Tarawa, Saipan, but Iwo Jima felt different. The air tasted like sulfur, metallic and rotten. Even the light seemed muted by ash drifting over the water. The men were silent. Only the distant thunder of battleships broke the stillness. The naval bombardment had been the most intense of the Pacific War, 3 days of constant shelling. And yet, as the first waves approached the shore, something was missing. No return fire. No machine guns. No mortars. Just the hiss of waves crawling over black sand. Dom frowned. "This is too easy." The ramp dropped. Marines poured out onto the beach, sinking nearly to their shins in volcanic ash that behaved less like sand and more like ball bearings. Men stumbled. Equipment jammed. Tanks bogged down instantly. Still no gunfire. Lieutenant Henry Cole shouted to his platoon, "Move! Move! Get off the open!" They slogged forward, climbing the embankment in labored steps. Dom passed a crater the size of a house, a fresh scar from battleship shells, and stared up at Suribachi's dark slopes. Then, as the third wave hit the beach, General Tadamaki Kuribayashi gave the order. All hell erupted at once. From hidden casemates, tunnels, and pillboxes camouflaged beneath the ash, Japanese guns opened fire with surgical precision. Heavy machine guns swept the beach in interlocking arcs. Mortars exploded among the dunes. Artillery hidden deep within the mountain thundered down on the landing zones. Marines fell by the dozens, cut down before they could even raise their rifles. Wounded men crawled through ash that clung to their hands like tar. Corpsmen sprinted between bursts of fire, dragging Marines behind the thin cover of stranded Amtraks. Domed flat as bullets shredded the air overhead. This was a trap, someone screamed. But Kuribayashi's brilliance was not in surprising the Marines, it was in refusing to fight the way Japan had always fought. There were no banzai charges. No suicidal waves. No mass assaults. Instead, he created a labyrinth of nearly 11 miles of tunnel, bunkers, and concealed firing positions that allowed the Japanese to strike from every direction, then vanish like ghosts. Japanese diaries later revealed Kuribayashi's mindset. The Marines are the strongest enemy Japan has ever faced. To fight them with reckless courage is to waste men. We must fight with discipline equal to theirs. This was the first time a major Japanese commander openly defied the suicidal doctrine of imperial headquarters. And it worked. ## The beachhead becomes a slaughterhouse. Rinaldi, on me! Lieutenant Cole shouted, waving his Thompson as he crawled forward across the dunes. Dom and his squad began a grueling advance. 20 yards of movement took nearly an hour. Machine gun fire stitched the ground around them. Mortar rounds churned the sand into black geysers. They reached the first Japanese pillbox, a squat fortress buried so deep only its firing slit was visible. A Marine engineer rushed forward with a satchel charge. He planted it against the wall. The explosion blasted ash 50 feet into the sky. But the gun kept firing. Inside the tunnel network, the Japanese simply changed positions, opening a new line of fire from a different angle. Flamethrowers roared to life. Fire engulfed the pillbox, but again, more firing from a ventilation shaft behind them. The Marines had never seen defenses like this. Even veterans of Tarawa and Saipan hesitated. A captured Japanese note found later in a bunker read, "Marines attack like a tide that never stops. Even our strongest positions fall. But we make them pay for every inch." They did pay. Horrifically. The ash made it nearly impossible to dig foxholes. Mortar fragments tore through men who had nowhere to hide. Flamethrower teams, priority targets for Japanese snipers, fell at twice the normal rate. Casualties mounted by the minute. By midday, stacks of wounded Marines formed at the waterline as Navy corpsmen performed triage under fire. Medics dragged men by their webbing, crawling through ash, firing one-handed to suppress snipers hidden in the ridges. Sergeant Dom Rinaldi sprinted across open ground, carrying a wounded radio operator on his back. Bullets struck the ash around him like raindrops hitting water. He didn't look back. Almost there. Hold on. He reached the makeshift aid station just as another artillery barrage slammed into the beach. Medics threw themselves over wounded Marines, using their own bodies as shields. One corpsman, arm soaked in blood, yelled, "We need plasma. Where's the next supply drop?" But the logistics miracle that defined Marine operations, seen on Saipan, was being tested like never before. LVTs burned on the shoreline. Landing waves were delayed by withering fire. Yet still, the Marine medical system kept moving, pulling wounded back to hospital ships within minutes. This capability stunned surviving Japanese officers who witnessed it. A junior Japanese lieutenant wrote, "Their wounded do not die alone. They are cared for like treasured sons. This gives their soldiers great strength. This is why they keep fighting." ### The race to Suribachi. By the second day, the Marines had split the island's southern tip. The 28th Marine Regiment received a singular, dangerous objective. Take Mount Suribachi. From its heights, the Japanese rained coordinated fire on nearly every landing zone. Snipers watched the beaches through telescopic sights. Mortars bracketed advancing lines. Dom's unit was reassigned to support the push. On the climb upward, the ash grew thicker, the heat more oppressive. The stench of sulfur filled their lungs with every breath. Machine gun nests lined the slopes. Japanese defenders emerged from tunnels, fired, then disappeared before Marines could respond. Flamethrowers cleared some. Grenades cleared others. But nothing was simple. Every advance felt like crawling into the maw of a furnace. On February 23, Dom watched from the lower slopes as a small patrol, just 40 men, reached the crater rim. They carried a small flag. As they raised it, ships offshore sounded their horns. Marines across the beach cheered. Men who had been silent for days shouted, laughed, cried, briefly forgetting the nightmare around them. Then, hours later, a larger flag was raised. This was the moment captured in the iconic photograph. But for men on the ground, it wasn't a symbol of victory. It was a reminder that the real battle, Kuribayashi's master defense, was only beginning. #Kuribayashi's second phase. When Suribachi fell, most Japanese commanders would have launched a final banzai charge. Kuribayashi did the opposite. He ordered his men deeper into the tunnel complex. He waited. He watched how Marines moved, reacted, coordinated. He studied their patterns, anticipating where they would attack next. His officers later recorded. Kuribayashi respected the Marines more than any enemy. He believed only disciplined defense could counter them. He was right. The next weeks became the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the Pacific War. Every trench led to another ambush. Every bunker connected to another bunker. Marines fought for yards at a time, losing dozens of men just to silence a single machine gun nest. Some nights, Marines heard Japanese soldiers whispering just beneath their feet, moving through tunnels only inches below the surface. Sometimes they heard singing. Sometimes coughing. Sometimes nothing at all. The psychological toll was immense. But still, the Marines advanced. The Japanese could not understand it. A Japanese sergeant, found dying near the northern cliffs, whispered to his captors, "Your Marines? They fight with the heart of warriors. But with machines that never sleep. We shoot them, but they rise again." By the time Kuribayashi launched his final counterattack, a coordinated night assault on March 25, his men were starving, exhausted, and nearly out of ammunition. But they followed him. And they died with him. When the sun rose, Kuribayashi lay dead among his troops, his sword in his hand. Iwo Jima was secured. But at a cost that stunned even hardened Marines. Nearly 7,000 Americans dead. Over 26,000 wounded. And out of roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 surrendered. Many Japanese officers who survived other battles would later admit, "Iwo Jima taught us the truth. The Marines were the most formidable enemy Japan ever faced." But the story wasn't over. One final island would reveal the darkest and most desperate Japanese tactics of the war, and show, once again, why Marines became the opponent the Japanese feared above all others. Okinawa. April 17, 1945. Southern Okinawa. Hill 89. Rain hammered the ridge like 1,000 drumming fists, turning clay into glue and every foxhole into a bitter, sucking pool. The wind carried the metallic tang of ruptured ammunition boxes and the sickly sweet rot of days-old casualties. Through the drifting smoke, Master Sergeant Harold "Red" Walker crouched behind a shattered limestone outcrop, mud coating his utilities, helmet dented from shrapnel that had sheared past him only minutes earlier. Ahead of him, the Marines of Fox Company pushed forward in a slow crawl, flamethrower teams advancing in careful bursts, bar gunners covering them with disciplined fire. Every few yards, another underground vent belched hot, acrid smoke, signs of the labyrinth beneath their boots, Kuribayashi's philosophy reborn here on Okinawa in vast, deep caverns. To their front, a tunnel entrance flickered to life with muzzle flashes. Corporal Ishikawa Takeo squeezed off a controlled burst with his Type 99 light machine gun, the weapon bucking in his hands as he covered a pair of stretcher-bearers retreating with a wounded comrade. He had been fighting since Saipan. He had watched company after company evaporate under the relentless American advance. And even now, eyes bloodshot, body exhausted, lips cracked from dehydration, he whispered the same line under his breath, one he had first heard in the ashes of the Marianas. "The Marines do not break. They do not stop." He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. It was a truth he had learned the hard way. Beneath the ridge, in the Warren-like headquarters hollowed into the limestone, Colonel Yahara Minoru, senior staff officer of the 32nd Army, studied the latest field report by the light of a flickering lantern. His uniform was stained with dust, his fountain pen trembled faintly in his hand. The note had come from a surviving platoon leader of the 15th Independent Mixed Regiment. Only 30% of his men remained. The report's handwriting was jagged, smudged, written in haste between artillery blasts. Marine infantry maintain cohesion even under constant bombardment. Their coordination with tanks and aircraft is beyond anything we prepared for. They assault fortified positions with unwavering aggression. Night or day, rain or shine. They come. Yahara exhaled slowly. He had seen the post-Saipan intelligence summaries, the interviews from wounded officers, the diaries recovered from caves on Poliliu and Iwo Jima. All painted the same picture. Why did his soldiers fear the Marines more than any other American force? He turned the page, revealing a captured Marine field manual, picked off a dead lieutenant during earlier fighting on Okinawa. Edges burnt, some pages missing, but enough remained to reveal the structured violence of modern amphibious doctrine. Sections highlighted by Japanese intelligence officers laid out the formula they had observed across 3 long years. Immediate establishment of beachhead logistics nodes, within minutes of landing. Close air support coordination, down to platoon-level observers. Combined arms breaching teams, trained explicitly for fortified Pacific Islands. A cultural expectation of aggressiveness and unit autonomy. Medical evacuation chains, capable of returning wounded Marines to ships in minutes, not hours. To a Japanese officer trained in the imperial doctrine of heroic sacrifice and rigid obedience, this manual might as well have been a blueprint for industrialized warfare they could never hope to match. And on Okinawa, it was killing them by the thousands. Above ground, the rain intensified. Sergeant Walker signaled his assault squad to stack near the cave mouth. Flamethrower operator PFC Dominic Reyes adjusted the dual tanks on his back, knuckles white around the M2's grip. 3-second burst, Walker shouted over the wind. Clear the mouth, then grenades. Move on my signal. Reyes nodded, fear and determination pulling at his features. The cave exhaled another volley, bullets snapping past their helmets like angry hornets. A Marine rifleman slumped to the mud, hit in the neck. Corpsman pulled him back instantly, compressing the wound, calling for a stretcher. Inside that cave, Lieutenant Nakamura Ruji tightened his grip on his Arisaka rifle. Behind him, a handful of survivors, 10 maybe, watched the shadows at the cavern entrance. Their faces were masks of dirt and despair. He spoke quietly, so his voice wouldn't tremble. Men, brace yourselves. When the Marines attack, they do not stop halfway. They push. Always push. No one responded. No one needed to. They had learned that truth on Poliliu. Watched it repeated on Iwo Jima. And now, in their final days on Okinawa, they knew this. American Marines did not rely on banzai charges, or reckless heroism, or divine winds. Their strength came from something far more terrifying. Relentless discipline combined with limitless resources. Walker gave his signal. Reyes surged forward, unleashing a roiling stream of fire. The cave mouth lit up like a collapsing star, heat slamming outward in a violent wave. Marines hurled grenades into the clearing smoke. The explosions shook the earth. Inside, the last defenders screamed, not in fear, but in fury, in hopeless defiance, as the ceiling crashed inward, entombing them. Corporal Ishikawa, outside his own cave network farther down the ridge, heard the blasts echo through the hills. He bowed his head. Not in shame. Not in despair. But in acknowledgement. For 3 years he had fought the Marines, from the malarial jungles of Guadalcanal to the sulfur fields of Iwo Jima to this final, rain-soaked hell. He had seen them bloodied, exhausted, sometimes even hesitant. But he had never seen them break. And that, he knew, was why Japanese soldiers feared them more than any other American force. Not because the Marines were superhuman. Not because they were cruel. Not even because they wielded overwhelming firepower. But because when the worst of war descended, when the terrain itself tried to kill them, when casualties mounted, when the enemy dug deeper than human endurance, the Marines kept coming anyway. Their willpower was a weapon. Their doctrine was a machine. Their presence was an omen. As night fell over Okinawa, the guns did not fall silent. They never did on this island. But across the shattered ridges, in isolated caves soon to be overrun, Japanese soldiers whispered the same refrain into the darkness, part lament, part respect, part final truth etched into their final hours. To fight the Marines is to fight the sea itself. Endless, patient, and impossible to stop. And with that final recognition, the last chapter of 3 years of brutal island warfare closed, not with a banzai charge, not with a triumphant victory, but with the quiet, solemn understanding of why the United States Marine Corps left such an indelible mark on the men who faced them. A respect carved into coral, smoke, and memory. A respect paid in lives. A respect that endures in every diary, every interview, every whispered recollection from those who survived the Pacific's inferno.